Letters, he dropped the letter on the table. They mean something. Here you are, isolated the village 2 miles away, and enough shrubbery round the place to hide a dozen assassins. If his manner had been in the slightest degree melodramatic, Dale would have found the ominous sentences more easy to discount. But this calm, intense statement of fact was a chill touch at her heart. And yet, but what enemies can Aunt Cornelia have? She asked helplessly. Any man will tell you what I do, said the doctor with increasing seriousness. He took a cigarette from his case and tapped it on the case to emphasize his words. This is no place for two women practically alone. Dale moved away from him restlessly to warm her hands at the fire. The doctor gave a quick glance around the room. Then, unseen by her, he stepped noiselessly over to the table, took the matchbox there off its holder and slipped it into his pocket. It seemed a curiously useless and meaningless gesture, but his next words evinced that the action had been deliberate. I don't seem to be able to find any matches, he said, with assumed carelessness, fiddling with the matchbox holder. Dale turned away from the fire. Oh, aren't there any? I'll get you some, she said with automatic politeness, and departed to search for them. The doctor watched her go, saw the door close behind her. Instantly his face set into tense and wary lines. He glanced about, then ran lightly into the alcove and noiselessly unfastened the bolt on the terrace door which he had pretended to fasten after his search of the shrubbery. When Dale returned with the matches, he was back where he had been when she had left him, glancing at a magazine on the table. He thanked her urbanely as she offered him the box. So sorry to trouble you, but tobacco is the one drug every doctor forbids his patients and prescribes for himself. Dale smiled at the little joke. He lit his cigarette and drew in the fragrant smoke with apparent gusto. But a moment later he had crushed out the glowing end in an ashtray. By the way, has Miss Van Gorder a revolver? He queried casually, glancing at his wristwatch. Yes. She fired it off this afternoon to see if it would work. Dale smiled at the memory. The doctor, too, seemed amused. If she tries to shoot anything, for goodness sake stand behind her, he advised. He glanced at the wristwatch again. Well, I must be going. If anything happens, said Dale slowly, I shall telephone you at once. Her words seemed to disturb the doctor slightly, but only for a second. He grew even more urbane. I'll be home shortly after midnight, he said. I'm stopping at the Johnsons' on my way. One of their children is ill, or supposed to be. He took a step toward the door, then he turned toward Dale again. Take a parting word of advice, he said. The thing to do with the midnight prowler is, let him alone. Lock your bedroom doors and don't let anything bring you out till morning. He glanced at Dale to see how she took the advice, his hand on the knob of the door. Thank you, said Dale seriously. Good night, Doctor. Billy will let you out. He has the key. By Jove, laughed the doctor. You are careful, aren't you? The place is like a fortress. Well, good night, Miss Dale. Good night. The door closed behind him. Dale was left alone. Suddenly her composure left her. The fixed smile died. She stood gazing ahead at nothing, her face a mask of terror and apprehension. But it was like a curtain that had lifted for a moment on some secret tragedy and then fallen again. When Billy returned with the front door key, she was as impassive as he was. Has the new gardener come yet? He here, said Billy stolidly. Name Brooke. She was entirely herself once more when Billy, departing, held the door open wide to admit Miss Cornelia Van Gorder and a tall, strong-featured man, quietly dressed, with reticent, piercing eyes, the detective. Dale's first conscious emotion was one of complete surprise. She had expected a heavy-set, blue-jowled vulgarian with a black cigar, a battered derby, and stubby policeman's shoes. Why, this man's a gentleman, she thought. At least he looks like one, and yet, you can tell from his face he'd have as little mercy as a steel trap for anyone he had to catch. She shuddered uncontrollably. Dale, dear, said Miss Cornelia with triumph in her voice. "This is Mr. Anderson." The newcomer bowed politely, glancing at her casually and then looking away. Miss Cornelia, however, was obviously in fine feather and relishing to the utmost the presence of a real detective in the house. "This is the room I spoke of," she said briskly. "All the disturbances have taken place around that terrace door." The detective took 3 swift steps into the alcove, glanced about it searchingly. He indicated the stairs. "That is not the main staircase?" "No, the main staircase is out there." Miss Cornelia waved her hand in the direction of the hall. The detective came out of the alcove and paused by the French windows. "I think there must be a conspiracy between the Architects' Association and the Housebreakers' Union these days," he said grimly. "Look at all that glass. All a burglar needs is a piece of putty and a diamond cutter to break in." "But the curious thing is," continued Miss Cornelia, "that whoever got into the house evidently had a key to that door." Again she indicated the terrace door, but Anderson did not seem to be listening to her. "Hello? What's this?" he said sharply, his eyes lighting on the broken glass below the shattered French window. He picked up a piece of glass and examined it. Dale cleared her throat. "It was broken from the outside a few minutes ago," she said. "The outside?" Instantly the detective had pulled aside a blind and was staring out into the darkness. "Yes, and then that letter was thrown in." She pointed to the threatening missive on the center table. Anderson picked it up, glanced through it, laid it down. All his movements were quick and sure, each executed with the minimum expense of effort. He said in a calm voice that held a glint of humor. "Curious, the anonymous letter complex. Apparently someone considers you an undesirable tenant." Miss Cornelia took up the tale. "There are some things I haven't told you yet," she said. "This house belonged to the late Courtleigh Fleming." He glanced at her sharply. "The Union Bank?" "Yes. I rented it for the summer and moved in last Monday. We have not had a really quiet night since I came. The very first night I saw a man with an electric flashlight making his way through the shrubbery." "You poor dear," from Dale sympathetically. "And you were here alone?" "Well, I had Lizzie and," said Miss Cornelia with enormous importance, opening the drawer of the center table, "I had my revolver. I know so little about these things, Mr. Anderson, that if I didn't hit a burglar I knew I'd hit somebody or something." She gazed with innocent awe directly down the muzzle of her beloved weapon, then waved it with an airy gesture beneath the detective's nose. Anderson gave an involuntary start, then his eyes lit up with grim mirth. "Would you mind putting that away?" he said suavely. "I like to get in the papers as much as anybody, but I don't want to have them say, 'omit flowers.'" Miss Cornelia gave him a glare of offended pride, but he endured it with such quiet equanimity that she merely replaced the revolver in the drawer with a hurt expression, and waited for him to open the next topic of conversation. He finished his preliminary survey of the room and returned to her. "Now you say you don't think anybody has got upstairs?" he queried. Miss Cornelia regarded the alcove stairs. "I think not. I'm a very light sleeper, especially since the papers have been so full of the exploits of this criminal they call the Bat. He's in them again tonight." She nodded toward the evening paper. The detective smiled faintly. "Yes, he's contrived to surround himself with such an air of mystery that it verges on the supernatural, or seems that way to newspaper men." "I confess," admitted Miss Cornelia, "I've thought of him in this connection." She looked at Anderson to see how he would take the suggestion, but the latter merely smiled again, this time more broadly. "That's going rather a long way for a theory," he said, "and the Bat is not in the habit of giving warnings." "Nevertheless," she insisted, "somebody has been trying to get into this house night after night." Anderson seemed to be revolving a theory in his mind. "Any liquor stored here?" he asked. Miss Cornelia nodded. "Yes." "What?" Miss Cornelia beamed at him maliciously. 11 bottles of homemade elderberry wine." "You're safe." The detective smiled ruefully. He picked up the evening paper, glanced at it, shook his head. I'd forget the bad in all this.